Welcome to this week's episode of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. I'm your host, Olga Peters, and this is the show where we talk about how everything in Montpelier shakes out for the rest of us. Want to welcome regular contributor Emily Kornheiser, one of three reps from the town of Brattleboro. Hello, Emily.
Good morning, Olga. So nice to see you today.
Nice to see you today, too. How are you feeling post 250th?
I am feeling ready for another 250 episodes.
Which is good. So we can start with James Pepper from the Cannabis Control Board, who has been a regular guest on this show, but it has been a while. So it's good to see you, Pepper.
Good to see you, too. Thanks for inviting me back.
Well, one reason I wanted to talk to Pepper listeners is because, you know, when we did a lot of, or I did a lot of coverage of the process leading up to the state regulating cannabis. And I know Emily and I did a few shows on it. And as a show that likes to focus on the stories behind policy, I'm not sure there's more stories than cannabis. And I'm curious, Pepper, I know we still have some regulations and some policies and some rulemaking that we're all working on, but how is the reality of a regulated cannabis market holding up to some of the stories that we told about it going into it?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think the reality, I think, is starting to meet expectations. Of course, it's still very early on in this market. We've started issuing licenses just in May of last year, so it's still very much kind of in its nascency. That being said, there are some early signs that we're achieving some of the goals we set out, and some of the goals just are to remind folks, we have an uncapped licensing system, so allowing access to the market, trying to prioritize small local farmers, trying to shift the existing kind of legacy market into a regulated space as opposed to stamping it out, which is what a lot of other states try to do. Also to support people that have been disproportionately harmed by the war on drugs, the decades-long war on drugs. And so when you kind of think about those as the guiding principles, and you look at the kind of licensing numbers and some of the revenue that's coming in, I think we're starting to meet our goals. So let me just give you a few of those numbers. To date, we've issued 544 total licenses. 399 of those are for cultivators, and so about 145 are just product manufacturers, wholesalers, retailers, etc. Of those 399 cultivators, 309 of them are tier 1 cultivators. That's 1,000 square feet of growing capacity or less, and that's 77%. So that's a real kind of market capture of what was the former kind of legacy market, it feels like. 40% of those, of all cultivation, is indoor, 60% is outdoor. That's an incredible boon for kind of our environmental goals. Controlled environment agriculture is just incredibly energy intensive. And when you think about the alternative, which is growing this crop out in the sun, there's very little carbon footprint. That's great numbers, and we thought that they would actually be flipped just because of our climate here. That we'd have much more indoor cultivation. When it comes to social equity, these are, again, social equity, and I'm sure we can dive deeper into this later. But these are licensees that either come from communities that have been disproportionately impacted by cannabis, or these licensees have been personally impacted by cannabis prohibition. So 86 of our licensees are social equity applicants. We actually, because we know that there's a lot of folks that haven't been directly impacted by cannabis prohibition, but have been impacted either historically disenfranchised or just impacted by government-led actions as opposed to kind of cannabis prohibition specifically. We created another category of licensees called economic empowerment licensees. These are, licensees that might come from the LGBTQ plus community, licensees that might be veterans, women-owned businesses. And we have 108 economic empowerment licensees. So it's a good array. I mean, it's not perfect, and certainly, there's a lot we need to do to help support these businesses and do better. But it's a good mix at the kind of in year one. And with respect to kind of how things are going, we have data from the first full year of sales. And so from October 1st, when our first retail shop opened, through September 30th of this year, we had 87 million, just over 87 million in taxable sales, which equates to 12.2 million in excise tax, new money that's come in, and then 5 million, just over 5 million in sales tax. So that's about what we expected. And, I think this market is still, again, maturing. And so I think we can expect to see those numbers go up steadily. But, there's a lot that goes into kind of the sales.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Pepper. What about you? You and I have been talking on email about Biden potentially recategorizing cannabis. Where is that at, and would that impact what we're doing?
And before we get to that question, can I add something, which I think is sort of this, like the story context for me, because that's sort of like the business environment, right? So this was like such a hotly debated topic in the legislature. The exact numbers that we were expecting was hotly debated. Whether like this was good for people or bad for people was hotly debated. Like all of it was just, like decades of debate. And certainly an issue of like particular importance and curiosity for Windham County, which is, I think, one of the reasons we had Pepper on the show so many times. But what's interesting is that like no one's really talking about it anymore, except for people who are like really in the market. And so what it's become, at least for me legislatively, is like a specific industry that has its specific challenges in, regulatory challenges, licensing challenges, et cetera. And that's now sort of the problem to solve, which I think is really an interesting spin. And so it's an industry with exceptions, right? Like real problems with banking, real problems with accessing, as we saw the flooding this summer, real problems with accessing federal money of any kind or things linked to federal money of any kind. And so this, like, we're like making this shift. And I think sort of what the Biden administration is thinking is part of how we deal with that shift. So anyway, back to you, Pepper.
Yeah. Well, no, and thanks for that context. I totally agree. I mean, my phone used to kind of blow up from reporters anytime we, made any pronouncement at all or issued any new license, and now it's quieted down quite a bit. That being said, and I'm not suggesting we need full normalization of cannabis, but the kind of idea that this is a crop, it comes from a seed, it grows out of the ground, and yet there's all of these kind of regulatory overlays to it, it still certainly exists. I mean, you think about kind of a cannabis farmers market, that seems kind of far out of reach even to this day, or kind of, having a hash bar for cannabis at a wedding, for instance, or at a music festival, that to me still feels pretty far out of reach. And some of it is just purely the kind of highway safety implications and, not having this kind of same infrastructure around detection and enforcement of DUI laws.
See, none of that feels very far away to me. That just feels like probably the next step. And like, that, again, that's just me living in Windham County, where we're like, these things were normalized before they were legalized. And so anyway,
I'm glad to hear that, because I was going to say, actually, because of the situation New York found itself in, where they licensed a bunch of growers, and then in an effort to kind of prioritize social equity applicants on the retail side, they were held up in a lawsuit. So all these growers had nowhere to kind of legally sell their legally grown cannabis. they just out of necessity started farmers markets. And they did it through kind of emergency legislation and then emergency rulemaking, and they've been a wild success. None of the kind of, public safety threats, none of the kind of, these are mostly cash transactions, none of the kind of, the sky didn't fall in New York. And I do think that, that provides us a decent model here in Vermont, to kind of follow in the footsteps of. But with respect to the rescheduling decision, Biden, just for context, asked his Agency of Health and Human Services to examine whether cannabis should remain a Schedule I controlled substance, which of course is the highest level, most restrictive schedule in the Controlled Substance Act. And they came back a few months ago with the recommendation that it should move to a Schedule III. And things that are on the Schedule III are like Xanax, Tylenol with codeine, more traditional kind of prescription medications, as opposed to Schedule I, which has, heroin and LSD on it. So that was the recommendation. This is actually fully an administrative decision unless Congress decides to get involved. So that recommendation went to the Department of Justice. The DEA is reviewing it. They're going to make a final recommendation to the Attorney General, and then the Attorney General, if they agree that it should be a Schedule III, can actually through an administrative process shift cannabis down to a Schedule III controlled substance, which has somewhat dramatic implications. Certainly, just from a perception-wise, stigma-wise, moving cannabis out of a grouping that includes, cocaine and methamphetamines. And moving it down to kind of a more therapeutic schedule makes a lot of sense. I know a lot of advocates wanted it to just be descheduled altogether, removed from the schedule. But I think that this is a significant step forward. Of course, the most dramatic impact immediately is that cannabis businesses would be allowed to write off their business expenses on their federal tax returns. I mean, other than that, which would be huge. It would be a shot in the arm for every single cannabis business that's paying, not just, an incredible amount for banking, insurance, no business loans, no financing. They also have to pay all of their taxes on all their kind of cost of goods sold and employee wages and rent. They don't get to write any of that off on their federal tax returns. So that is just money in their pocket overnight, and a real boost for these struggling businesses. Because sure, there's a demand for cannabis. It's kind of like, how could a cannabis business fail? There's such a huge demand, but really, when you think about all of the regulatory costs and the fact that these businesses don't have access to lines of credit or capital, this would be a lifeline to them.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Pepper. Just out of curiosity, can cannabis businesses in Vermont write anything off on their state taxes?
They can, yes. And I can't give any sort of advice on that because it's also just not an area of my expertise, but there's a whole section of the tax code that the state tax code that kind of exempts them from 280 on their state filing.
But it makes them, the state taxes are paltry compared to federal taxes or anyone, right? Everyone knows that for their own personal taxes, but there's also most state taxes for folks who are sort of filing in a more ordinary situation. The bulk of your paperwork just travels through to your state filing. And so if you're in a particular category, and cannabis isn't the only category, folks without social security numbers, for instance, would be another category. You have to basically create a whole new package of paperwork just for your state taxes, which is pretty labor intensive because you are having sort of two different filing systems. And so would that schedule change have any impact on banking at all or insurance?
Not that we are aware of. Not that I can see. I mean, it will increase the ability for kind of traditional research. Big pharma could come in and start you know, it's much easier to possess and use cannabis Schedule 3 for clinical trials and things like that. And then there's also the criminal, like kind of mandatory minimums in federal crimes for trafficking Schedule 1 drugs versus Schedule 3 are vastly different. So there are some kind of second and third order benefits to being Schedule 3, but I don't think the banking, of course, there was kind of a historic moment a few months ago also where safe banking for the first time ever passed favorably out of a Senate committee. Of course, then there was the whole Speaker of the House debacle. And so the House, which has passed safe banking, I think 9 times already, is now the holdup to safe banking moving forward in the Senate because it doesn't have a clear path anymore. And that would have kind of given the same protections that state chartered credit unions, would extend those pretty much to national banks, which doesn't again really change the dynamics because you still have to, even if you are a federally chartered bank, you'd still have to put in all the same kind of compliance and suspicious activity reporting requirements that the credit unions have, but it would increase purely the number of banks that would be willing to bank cannabis funds, and hopefully that competition would drive down fees.
Okay.
Thank you. So for the work that the Cannabis Control Board is doing right now, Pepper, what are you seeing as far as opportunities or challenges on the horizon?
I always am concerned about supply and demand. Of course, that is always a big one for us. I mean, when we created our kind of market structure and our tiering of licenses, we really were doing it, without knowing how much entrepreneurial interest there was going to be. We kind of were able to discern, and it's seeming like relatively closely what the demand for cannabis is going to be. Obviously, it changes based upon a number of policy factors, but there are, trying to determine whether we're going to have, 6 big companies want to come in and kind of dominate this market, or 309,000 square feet, legacy cultivators come in and try and saturate this market, was a big question mark. And of course, it's all related to how much regulatory burden are we going to place on them, what the cost of running one of these businesses is going to be, and also what the price of cannabis is. And we have an uncapped licensing system, as I mentioned. And so, we created some larger tiers, just thinking that, well, we have to supply the demand, and maybe we might need a larger tier. But I would also just note that our largest tier that we created was kind of a tier 3 out of 11 in Massachusetts. So it's all relative. What we didn't want to run into the problem that we're seeing in Oklahoma and Oregon. Oregon, just licensed people without any sort of real concern about supply and demand. They didn't want to kind of force the market in any one direction. So they're now producing way too much cannabis, and there's a price crash every year. And so they put a moratorium on all new cultivation licenses. It's been in effect for over 4 years. Oklahoma, they just did a recent supply and demand analysis. They have very low barriers to entry, very low fees, no kind of regulatory burden. They're cultivating 64 grams of cannabis for every 1 gram of demand, which just is an unsustainable market. And so if we are gonna, what we did very recently is we have 6 tiers of cultivation. We closed 4, 5, and 6. So the next kind of entrance into this market will all be in the kind of tier 1, 2, or 3. The tier 3 being 5,000 square feet of cannabis. That'll be the largest tier available to new entrants.
And so I just want to sort of refresh my memory and the memory of anyone listening here. So what I remember is that sort of you originally opened up just those tier 1, 2, and 3s when the market started, and then sort of opened up 4, 5, and 6, and now you're closing them back again. Can you help me with that?
Yeah. So the first 3 months, I think it was 3 months, it was just tier ones that were allowed to enter. So they got a little bit of a head start, and this was really aimed at trying to get them in, especially the outdoor cultivators, as soon as possible so they could take advantage of the outdoor growing season in year one. We, after a few months opened up tiers. We always left tier 6 closed. We had that kind of in our back pocket in case there was zero entrepreneurial demand and we were falling well short of our supply targets. So we opened up 2 through 5 a few months later. We decided to close 5 earlier this year. And then at our last board meeting a month ago, we decided to close tier 4 as well. And we're still contemplating, we understand that there are going to be, successful people, and there are going to be kind of people that need to get out of this market that are unsuccessful. And that we may need tier 4s, but our thought is, at least for now, close it out, and then if we can kind of form benchmarks that a tier 3 could hit, if they're using 100% of their canopy and they're selling, at least 80% of their product, that they might be able to graduate to a tier 4. So something along those lines. We're still trying to figure out the details. I mean, Massachusetts, they have kind of the opposite system where they'll license you at a large tier. And if you're not using 100 or 80% of it, or if you're not selling at least 65% of your product, then they claw back that excess unutilized canopy. And we kind of want to move in the opposite direction, where you have to start small. You can graduate to a larger tier if you're successful.
So just want to make sure my understanding is in the right place, Pepper. It sounds to me like one of the reasons you're concerned about supply and demand is that, to some extent, are these state markets still kind of closed in the sense that they're marked by state borders? It's not like someone can be growing cannabis in Vermont and selling it in California, like you could a sweater or a pair of socks or something like that.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, because the Schedule 1 status, and this would be true even with Schedule 3, whatever cannabis is sold in Vermont has to be grown here, has to be tested here, processed, packaged here. We can't rely on cannabis that's grown out of state to meet our demand. And on the flip side, we can't ship cannabis out of the state if there's a drastic oversupply. So it's a very fine line that we're trying to walk here on supply and demand, because we don't want prices to be so high that we don't want to have an undersupply, and prices are so high that consumers don't want to go to the regulated market. And we also don't want prices to be so low that our cultivators, who are literally risking all of their kind of private capital, can't be successful. So it's very much a managed market as a result of that kind of federal status.
I wonder, as this market goes on, what it will teach us about our own economy in Vermont, since it is, stuck to the borders.
Yeah, it's the only, for any other commerce issue, we are absolutely prohibited from restricting it within the border. So it is a really interesting experiment. I have lots of questions about processors and retailers, but I can wait on them until after the break, if that makes sense, Olga, or if we have
Let's do that. Yeah, because we're just down to
Yeah.
5 minutes. But yes, I have questions about testing and processing as well. So since we do have only a few minutes before the break, Pepper, you were talking about challenges and opportunities. What are some of the opportunities that you see?
Well, we do have one of the most exciting, I'll just say the most exciting small market in the country, just given the way that we went about licensing people and the way that we already had the best growers in the country here in Vermont, certainly on the East Coast. We have a reputation for having the best cannabis in certainly the East Coast. And the fact that they were willing to jump into this market and, fully participate in a regulated market just means that Vermont has this amazing opportunity to kind of take advantage of this expertise. And I'm not advocating for any of these things, but there are any number of issues that, or any number of policy decisions that the legislature could make that would fully kind of, or allow for a more mature market and allow greater access for these cultivators. And, special events is something that people are starting to figure out. I mentioned New York has their farmers markets. I think, a special event, festivals, where we can kind of allow these cultivators to really showcase their products would be great. We have to figure out, I think we have to figure out, it doesn't have to be next legislative session, but somehow to on-site consumption. I think that's, it kind of it harkens back to when we kind of allowed home grow. It's like, well, where are the seeds and the plants coming from? Well, don't ask, don't tell. And that's kind of where we're at with consumption. Is there's literally no legal place for a tourist, and our market has quite a lot of tourists to legally consume cannabis. So the kind of whole hospitality industry is, I think, the kind of next phase. And once we can figure out some safety rails around the kind of highway safety concerns, I think we can get there.
I really, when I think about all of the local breweries and a few local wineries and how important that flight is for how they engage with folks and how they really show their product even to each other or to retailers, that seems like a really important part of just like exactly like you said, like really sort of getting the word out and making sure that consumers understand what products are being grown and sold.
I mean, absolutely. I just I don't understand how, if we are moving towards federal legalization, which it feels like we're there. I mean, it's still at least a half decade away, probably longer. But these companies need to get their client base and need to establish their brands, and it's really challenging in this environment, especially with our advertising laws, for them to do that. And so I do feel like having more direct access to the market is how they're going to be able to do that, how they're going to be able to tell their story. And we're always trying to figure out how to better support our smallest cultivators, because their operating costs are fixed. They just, and these are folks that spend a lot of time. They spend the most amount of time of all the members in the supply chain with the plants, putting in the work, the kind of one-on-one time with their plants, and yet they're making the least amount of money. So how do we support the kind of tier one cultivators and make their business more profitable? And also, to a large extent, they've never been in a regulated environment before. So then the notion that they need to register a product or get a kind of certificate of analysis, or kind of follow very strict packaging and labeling guidelines is all new, or even kind of start a website or kind of put together an employee manual. So trying to find ways to support these smaller businesses in this new industry is also a challenge and an opportunity.
Thank you, Pepper. So we're out of time in the first half of the happy hour here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. But stay tuned. We're going to hear from some underwriters, and then we will be right back with James Pepper from the Cannabis Control Board. Welcome back to the second half of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. If you're just joining us, I am your host, Olga Peters, and I'm speaking with regular contributor Emily Kornheiser, who's one of 3 reps from the town of Brattleboro, and James Pepper, who is heading up the Cannabis Control Board. And guess what? That's what we're talking about, is cannabis today. I want to thank BCTV for sharing the video version of our show with public access and community media centers around the state. You can also find us wherever you subscribe to your podcast, just FYI. So, Pepper.
Wait.
Oh, no. Wait, Emily.
Wait. I have a part to play. The views and opinions expressed. The views and opinions expressed here on the Montpelier Happy Hour are those of the host and the guests, respectively, and not the station, platform, friend, nor employer.
Well done. Thank you. Next time, Pepper, though, you're going to have to say that one. Instead of your
I'm
fifth
getting
time
it down.
jacket.
Yeah, yeah. You left out pets and birds and you know.
I do pet sometimes. I do
Yeah.
today.
Okay, you are officially anointed, Pepper, as being on the show enough to know Emily's spiel. I applaud you. And so before the break, we were talking about some of the challenges and opportunities that you were seeing in the cannabis market as it stands now. Now, Emily, you had some questions around processing and testing, I believe.
Yeah. Pepper, you listed sort of the number of all the other licenses other than cultivation. And I was curious how many of those licenses are in the processing space rather than the retail space. And if you could just tell us more about what sort of the processing looks like. I remember concerns about some choke points in the supply chain related to processing. And then I'm also curious about sort of the value added product processing and how that is going.
Yeah, it's actually going pretty well. I mean, we have 63 product manufacturers licensed, which is a good number. You know, they're mixed. We created 3 tiers, and essentially one is a home-based product manufacturer. If you just kind of need some supplemental income and you've got cannabis, you can kind of make some cookies, do some pre-rolls, do you know, little projects. And it's a very low barrier to entry license type. You know, the tier 2 product manufacturer is allowed to use any extraction methods except for the ones that require kind of a explosion safe room, you know, the kind of volatile solvents. And then the tier 3 can use any extraction method, including the volatile solvents. The vast majority of our product manufacturers are tier 2. And I think they're doing a great job. We have, I think, over 3,000 unique products registered in Vermont. So there's a great diversity of products. And, you know, we did kind of one of our major rule changes this year was around kind of potentially hazardous foods. This is something where, you know, it's just a shortcoming of our staffing, and not the staff themselves, but just our staffing and our partnerships with other agencies. We don't have the ability at the Cannabis Board to certify commercial kitchens. And so when it comes to foods that require strict kind of pH levels and temperature controls and safe handling, we just aren't in a place where we can kind of oversee that safely. So, you know, I know there's a number of product manufacturers that wanted to make things like ice cream, THC infused ice creams, THC infused like barbecue sauce, THC infused kind of beef jerky. And we just are not at a place quite yet. Well, listen, I don't want to.
I'm sorry. I hope whoever wanted to do that does not hear me say that. The ice cream sauce sound great. I don't know what it is about the beef jerky.
Okay, how about take and bake raw cookie dough? You know, that's
yes,
one.
Great. Okay.
Yes. Okay.
There you go. That one works.
And I actually feel like with some kind of co-training with the Department of Health, maybe bringing on some kind of kitchen experts, we could certify certain licensees to do certain activities, and maybe not the full gamut of a commercial kitchen, but certain types of kind of temperature controlled processes, get those in place. So, you know, again, I've always liked to just come back to, this isn't a fully mature market. We're at the very beginning here, and I think we will get to kind of unleash the full creative economy here. It's just going to take some time.
And then what about sort of the part of processing that's like the drying or the extraction? What does that part of the market look like? How many players are in it? Is it sort of regionally dispersed in a way that's working for farmers?
Yeah, the farmers are allowed to do a lot of that on site. So the cultivators are authorized to do certain activities, and they can make pre-rolls on site. They can sell in bulk to kind of wholesalers or product manufacturers, but it's really the manufacturers that are doing all the extraction. So that those 63 licensees are in charge of that. I mean, They're pretty well distributed around the state. The one part that's really tough for especially people down in Windham County is that the two testing facilities, the only two in the state that are allowed to touch cannabis, are up in Colchester. So, it's a full day of travel for anyone down south trying to kind of get their products up there. And there's just, because again, cannabis can't cross state lines. There's a bunch of labs in Massachusetts that'd be more than willing to test that are a lot closer. But we just don't have that ability.
And so people are mostly drying on site and then doing their own extractions for their own products. They're not sort of selling extractions to someone else who's going to process. Is that what you're saying?
I think you're seeing a lot of variability there.
Okay.
I think it's very dependent on, I mean, in order to do extractions, any sort of mechanical extraction, you need a processor license. But there's certainly a number of cultivators that also have a manufacturing license, one of the 3 tiers.
And I'm asking because I remember that when we were actually passing the laws, there was a lot of debate and nervousness about we were going to have, it would be harvest time and we wouldn't have enough processors distributed well enough, or enough sort of drying facilities on site that we were going to have just sort of like a glut of moldy weed.
And that has not materialized quite as
Great.
much. And this is, we're in the kind of post-harvest, time frame right now. And this is the crunch time for the labs and the product manufacturers. But a lot of the cultivators have found clever ways of kind of either flash freezing or doing certain things to kind of maintain the quality of their cannabis while they're waiting in line for a product manufacturer. But we do have a decent number of them. I think we're in decent shape when it comes to that piece of the supply chain.
That's great to hear.
So one concern I hear come up over and over again, which means it hasn't been answered for folks in my mind, is the levels of THC in different products, and that they are higher than what a lot of people grew up with in, say, the 60s, 70s, 80s, even 90s. Is the state having any conversations around that? Or like capping the levels of THC, or?
Yes, this is kind of a perennial issue in the legislature. The Cannabis Board is so there's 3 THC caps right now. There's a 30% cap on THC in flower, smokable flower. There's a 60% cap on THC in solid concentrates. And then there is a 5 milligram THC cap, and then on edibles per serving, and then 100 in the package. And, those to me were policy decisions. They're aimed at trying to not have kind of a drive towards just, kind of juicing a product with THC, which is the psychoactive component of cannabis. We're one of very few states that have either of those first 2 caps. We're pretty much online or in line with most states around the kind of 5 milligrams per serving and the 100 milligrams per package. Some states have 10 milligram cap. But really, I understand the concern, but the way that I have framed it in the past, and I think is legitimate, is that the whole purpose behind having a taxed and regulated product is that it's safer.
It's labeled.
It's tested.
Make informed decisions.
You know what's in it. Exactly. To create a solid concentrate, you're using some kind of extraction method, which leaves behind residuals. And so why leave that lane for solid concentrates, especially when you think about, like, if you're using,
sorry, Pepper, solid concentrates, is that like for vape pens, or?
No, that would
can
be
you tell liquid. I don't consume?
Yeah. that falls under the liquid concentrate, and I think the legislature recognized that just leaving the illicit market to supply the demand for vaping cartridges was a very bad idea. It was demonstrated during the Uvalde crisis. It's a very bad idea. But the same logic applies to solid concentrates. I mean, dabs, shatter wax, those types of things.
Okay.
And
You not
really,
knowingly, like as if you know what all of those things mean.
I do know what those things are.
It's just kind of like, it's better to just know that it's been through some regulatory framework, and that what's on the label is accurate, and there's no kind of concentrated pesticides in there. There's no concentrated adulterants in there, contaminants. I'm not saying that they're healthy for you or that you should be using them, but I do feel like a regulated product is always better than an unregulated product. And I think that the real conversation should be around how they're marketed and advertised, have very strict controls around them, and just allow, and a lot of education at the point of sale about what they are, what their impacts are. And probably if you're, first time consumer, stay away from them. But I just don't, so again, like I don't see this issue changing anytime soon, just because the stars have not aligned on removing any of those caps anytime soon, but or at least historically. But we'll certainly make the argument once again.
What it seems like it would be very hard to grow to such like an exact percentage specification. And so what happens when someone is growing and it winds up testing too high?
You
Do
can
they just
send
look
it
at
to
themselves,
extraction.
or
No, well, if it does test too high,
Second
I mean,
sales.
there are ways to remediate that by blending it for like a pre-roll with something else,
Okay.
a lower THC. You can send it to extraction so it can become inedible. I mean, 30% really, it's somewhat of a natural ceiling. I know that the growers just go crazy every time I say that, because certainly you can get above that, but you really have to be focused on just that, and not trying to kind of create 1,000 square feet of it. Is really just kind of like, so I that one to me is not quite as important, but it is just it's not there for any other reason except people are a little bit nervous about high potency cannabis. So,
well, it's interesting, in the context of sort of Vermont's beer market, and like I don't really like very hoppy or very strong beer. I really like a fruity, flowery Pilsner and like fairly low alcohol in it. And I know, like, I don't know if I'm gonna get kicked out of the state for saying that, but like I don't like my beer to punch me in the face, right? Like I like to have a more subtle experience of it. And it's interesting, this assumption that things would sort of become a race to the most extreme rather than sort of meeting like a diverse market demand, where people want, very different sensations from their cannabis, or very different flavors, or very, like
I'm with you there. I
buy
mean,
gummies that are like, as we like, she's cutting her gummies into like sixths because that's how low a dose she wants, and that works for her.
yeah, and the fastest growing demographic of new consumers are people over the age of 50 that are trying cannabis almost sometimes for their first time, or largely for their first time, and they really don't want that. And then there's also kind of a growing understanding amongst consumers that other aspects other than THC are what are kind of enhancing the experience, the terpenoids and the lesser cannabinoids, than not just THC. And so really, I think the future of the market is not just trying to grow the highest potency THC, but then again, the THC is where the money is. And that's so like a grower, whether it's going for smokable flower or not, wants to create as much THC because that's essentially what they're purchasing their license for, is trying to. And so, the cap just, there's no real logic to it other than the kind of fear that, just like high ABV alcohol is just kind of bad for society in general. It's kind of a societal norm, I think, that was put into place.
Yeah. I have sort of some like Brattleboro question reality checks. One, when we started having CBD for sale at the Brattleboro Farmers Market, like it was intense, like people's reactions to it was intense because the entire market area smelled very, very, very strongly. Like including the parking lot, right? Because it was like freshly harvested, it was sticky, it was, and people were seeing it. But like everyone's gotten over it now. So I feel like if the exact same product that had THC in it showed up, the shock and awe of it all, I think, has passed. But I'm wondering about retail and the number of retail establishments. And it kind of boggles my mind when I'm sort of like driving out more in our strip mall areas, how many establishments there seem to be. And I just don't understand how they're all gonna stay in business. And so I'm just like, how is that working? How is that looking? It seems like new retail establishments are still opening in fairly established markets. What is that all looking like from your perspective?
Yeah, and this is an area of concern for me. You know, so just by the numbers, I think I think there's 67 retailers that are open, and I think there's 13 more licenses that we've issued, so that haven't opened yet. So I think 80 is the number currently. There are 13 in Burlington. There are, I think, 3, including a medical dispensary in Brattleboro.
I think it's more than that, Pepper.
It could be. You know, what we do is every week or every board meeting, we publish the kind of areas of density of retail to try and like signal to retailers, hey, you might not want to go to Brattleboro, like they're saturated. But you know, this saturation, these areas of density are a direct result of a policy decision that the legislature made that a town cannot host a cannabis retail establishment unless their citizens vote to allow it. And so we have, I think, maybe 80 or 90, I can't remember the exact number of towns that allow it. And then the rest, the other 200 and, 190 don't. And so you're seeing, pockets of retailers that are unnatural. That I say that there's 13 in Burlington. Well, there's 0 in South Burlington. There's 0 in Williston, and that's because they haven't opted in yet. And I don't even know if they know to opt in. I just I try and get the word out as well as I can, but there's no way Burlington can support 13, and I know there's probably more in the pipeline. And again, we're not trying to have too heavy a hand in kind of controlling this market, but really, the folks that are starting these cannabis businesses are putting up a lot of their own private money and their friends and families' private money. And when they crash out of this because of they can't sustain themselves, it's very personally devastating for the owners of these licenses. So, I one thing just for the health of the market is I would like to see that opt-in provision switch. So you're presumptively in unless you vote to be out of the retail establishments. And I think that would lead to a much more geographically diverse setup and a much more sustainable setup. And also there are kind of cannabis deserts out there, or legal cannabis deserts, where you have to drive kind of 30 miles round trip to get to a dispensary.
And what areas of the state is that?
I think there's one in Roxbury, but other than that, within like a 30-mile like radius of that shop, there's 0, I think. And the kind of south of the north, like the southern part of the Northeast Kingdom, there's one in Bradford, but I don't think there's anything more until St. Johnsbury. It's not like, and the problem that we have also is that the authority that we were granted was not to cap the number of retail stores in a given area. We're allowed to just say no new retail applications, period. So we could do that. But it would be statewide. So we would have to just decide that the 13 that are in Burlington, those are the only ones that are going to be there. The status quo is going to be the permanent status.
Well, and I don't think that's yours to do. I mean, I have been surprised looking at Putney Road in Brattleboro to be like, why would you open a third shop here? Like what motivates someone to do that? But it's also something that happens in a lot of other markets too, right? Like why are there 3 Italian restaurants and no Mexican restaurants? Like what makes it's like people have the dream of the business they want to open, and whether the market is already sort of saturated with it, you believe that what you're selling is better, and so you jump on in.
Well, I think what's interesting, Pepper, you can correct me, But I think one thing that's interesting about our little kind of corridor of Windham County is I don't remember what the votes were, but at one point I think both Wilmington and Dover were considering opting out of having any retail.
Wilmington does have
Uh,
retail.
okay,
Wilmington does,
does.
but I do think that there is a question about whether they should subsequently opt out. I think, because you can opt in and then later opt out, and then whatever's in your town will stay, but you won't have any new ones.
Okay.
Well,
I don't
my,
think
my point being that it shifts where you can even have the businesses if your surrounding towns have
Yeah.
opted out.
Yeah, absolutely.
And on that hammer, we have just about 5 minutes, Pepper, and I don't know if there's anything else around retail you want to add, but I'm wondering, we haven't really heard a lot about the medical marijuana side of, or medical cannabis side of the market. Is there anything happening there that folks might want to know about?
There is, and I'm glad you mentioned it because honestly, the medical is one of the most important aspects to the market, which is this is serving the most the patients that rely on cannabis as medicine as opposed to kind of recreationally. And the medical program historically has been under the Department of Public Safety, and they were kind of a reluctant home for that program, and so they didn't update the program continuously over the years, and that's no criticism of them. They've got other priorities. So the board has endeavored to really update the program. We had kind of a technical amendments bill last year that made some really critical changes, but this year we're going to submit a new report to the legislature that really tries to kind of fundamentally update the program because it is on the ropes. I mean, their patients are in decline. The number of patients on the registry are in decline. The locations around the state are largely inaccessible. There's 6 locations around the state, and most people have to drive a long way to get to access one.
Which sucks when you're sick.
It really does. And I'd like to give a shout out to I think it's the Brandon dispensary, which does deliveries all around the state, which is a huge benefit to the patients. But we've been holding a series of stakeholder meetings over the summer and fall. We're about to kind of finalize our draft recommendations to the legislature for a report due in January. But we're going to look at the process of adding new qualifying conditions. Our qualifying conditions list is very short, and it really, to add a new qualifying condition requires intense advocacy on behalf of patients that are suffering, to get out of bed, make it to Montpelier or Zoom in now, to kind of talk about cannabis and overcome this basic threshold, which is a Schedule I controlled substance. The definition is it has no medical uses. So, legislators and policymakers can just look to the Schedule I and say, well, I'm not adding this for a new qualifying condition because there are no accepted medical uses for cannabis. And so we're looking at kind of how other states add new qualifying conditions and how you can kind of remove the politics of that process, or remove politics from that process and kind of really be evidence-based. We're also looking at the possibility of having some of our adult use retailers that are willing to do certain kind of jump through certain hoops, whether that's, adding plans for patient privacy, adding kind of specialty products that aren't available in the adult use market to their kind of shelves, having increased education. If they're willing to do that, then maybe they can kind of have patients shop at their stores tax-free. Which would require a legislative change, but that's kind of one issue that we're looking at as well. And then, we, for some reason, well, I know why, but medical products currently don't need to be tested except for potency. So no heavy metal testing, no contaminant testing. And so we're going to update that as soon as we can, but we also don't want to increase costs for patients. So we're going to look at ways either through the state lab that's being created, or through subsidies to help kind of cover that testing added expense.
That sounds
Thank
great.
you. Yeah. So we unfortunately are out of time on the Montpelier Happy Hour, but I want to thank James Pepper from the Cannabis Control Board for joining us today and nerding out over cannabis with us. James, if people want to learn more about what your board does, or keep abreast to things as they develop, where can they find more information?
Our website is ccb.vermont.gov. And from there, there's a button you can press if you want to be added to kind of our newsletter. We're also on, I think, Instagram and Twitter. If you just look for VTCCB, and we're on all of our meetings. Everything we do is on YouTube as well, going back to the very first days of the Cannabis Board. So if anyone wants to go on a very long, very boring journey, you just type VTCCB into YouTube and you kind of see us from our very early days.
Yes, cannabis was one of those issues as a reporter. Every time I went to write a new article, I'd have to remind myself, wait a minute, didn't we regulate this yet? We've been talking about it long enough. Hasn't it happened? Anyway, Emily, if people want to learn more about your work or get in touch, where can they do that?
Folks can go to emilykornheiser.org, where you will find links to all of the various ways to get in touch.
Thank you. And as always, the Montpelier Happy Hour is on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station, every Friday at 2 and rebroadcast Wednesday morning. You can subscribe to us wherever you find your podcasts, or drop me a line at the Montpelier Happy Hour at gmail.com. Take care, everyone. Have a good weekend.